The Empire strikes back. It was the winter of 1814, and the British Empire was in a murderous mood. Napoleon Bonaparte, the great enemy of Britain for over 2 decades, had finally been crushed and exiled to the lonely island of Elba. The long and devastating Napoleonic Wars were over, and for the first time in a generation, Britain's most battle-hardened veterans, the Iron Men who had bled across Spain, Portugal, Egypt, and France, were suddenly free. Their muskets were still warm. Their bayonets had not yet been cleaned. And their commanders had a new target in mind. America. The War of 1812 had dragged on for 2 years with neither side achieving decisive victory. The British had burned Washington, D.C. to the ground that August, watching the flames consume the White House and the Capitol. But the war was not won. And now, with tens of thousands of Napoleonic veterans available, the British High Command hatched an audacious plan that would reshape the entire continent of North America. They would seize New Orleans. It was not merely a city. New Orleans was the gateway to the entire Mississippi River, the economic spine of a young, sprawling nation. 1/3 of all American produce passed through its docks. $14 million in cotton sat waiting in its warehouses, strangled by the British naval blockade. Whoever controlled New Orleans controlled the wealth of the American interior. And if Britain could take it and hold it, they could strangle the new republic into submission, carve up the Louisiana Territory, and perhaps, just perhaps, reverse the humiliating outcome of the American Revolution itself. In the autumn of 1814, a fleet of more than 50 British warships sailed into the Gulf of Mexico. Aboard those ships were over 10,000 soldiers, veterans of the Peninsular War, men who had fought Wellington's grueling campaigns across Europe with discipline and ferocity. At their head was Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, the Duke of Wellington's own brother-in-law, a man of iron reputation and burning ambition. Pakenham was confident. He had every reason to be. The man called Old Hickory. 1,000 miles away, a tall, gaunt man with a shock of silver-white hair was riding furiously south through the night. Andrew Jackson had been ordered to defend New Orleans. He arrived on December 1, 1814 to find a city in panic. The streets hummed with fear. Wealthy Creole families were packing their silver. Merchants argued about surrender. The city's defenses were a joke, a patchwork of unmanned forts, crumbling earthworks, and inadequate militia. The British fleet was already spotted in the Gulf. Time was nearly gone. Jackson looked at the chaos around him and felt something clarify inside him. He had felt this before, at Horseshoe Bend, fighting the Creek warriors, at Fort Mims after the massacre, in a dozen brutal frontier skirmishes that had left his body riddled with bullets and his soul hard as iron hickory wood. The men who rode with him called him Old Hickory, and it was not a compliment so much as a description of his essential nature. He did not bend. He did not break. He was 57 years old, sick with dysentery, thin as a rail, still carrying a British musket ball in his chest from a duel fought years ago. None of it mattered. "I will smash them, so help me God," he reportedly told his officers. Then he got to work. Jackson knew he could not match the British in open battle, not against Napoleonic veterans. But he understood something his enemy did not fully appreciate. The terrain around New Orleans was a maze of swamps, bayous, and narrow choke points that neutralized the British advantage in numbers and training. He needed only one good defensive line, and he would bleed them white. He began assembling the strangest army in American history. Tennessee and Kentucky frontiersmen, crack shots who had grown up hunting in the deep wilderness. Louisiana Creole militia, descended from French settlers who knew the bayous like their own heartbeat. A battalion of free men of color, over 500 black soldiers who fought with desperate determination to defend a city where their families lived. Choctaw warriors, silent and lethal. United States Marines. Regular Army regiments. And Jean Lafitte, the pirate king of Barataria, a charming rogue who had been offered $30,000 by the British to betray the city. He refused them, showed up at Jackson's headquarters instead, and offered his services and his cannons. It was an army that should not have worked. It did. The night battle. The British advanced on December 23, 1814. Their scouts had found a secret route through the bayous, a passage the Americans had overlooked, and by nightfall, 1,800 British veterans stood just 5 miles from the center of New Orleans. Pakenham was certain the city was his. He did not know that a slave named Louis, working on the plantation where the British had camped, had slipped away in the darkness to warn the Americans. Jackson received the intelligence and made a decision that shocked his officers: he would attack. Tonight. In the dark. Against a numerically superior, battle-hardened enemy who had not yet fully deployed. The night battle of December 23 was savage and chaotic. The USS Carolina unleashed a thundering broadside into the British camp, setting tents ablaze and killing men as they scrambled from their sleep. Jackson's infantry charged through the darkness and the smoke. The fighting was brutal and confused, soldiers stabbing and grappling at close quarters, officers screaming orders that nobody could hear. Neither side could gain the upper hand in the fog and black powder smoke. Eventually, Jackson pulled his men back to the Rodriguez Canal. But he had delivered a message. The Americans would not wait to be attacked. They would come for you. The British were shaken. Pakenham, who had arrived to take command on Christmas Day, found his army sobered and cautious. He called for his heavy artillery to be hauled up from the ships, a grueling task that took days of backbreaking labor through swampy terrain. He would bombard the Americans off their defensive line first. Then he would march in and collect the city. Line Jackson. While the British dragged their cannons forward, Jackson built his fortress. The Rodriguez Canal stretched 3/4 of a mile from the Mississippi River to a dense, impassable cypress swamp. It was not wide, perhaps 10 to 15 feet across, and not deep. But it was a natural moat, and behind it, Jackson's men labored around the clock, throwing up earthworks from the Mississippi mud. Cotton bales were stacked into the parapet. Artillery was carefully positioned. The line was manned by 8 batteries of cannon, a mix of naval guns, Army field artillery, and the pirate Lafitte's own weapons, crewed by his skilled Barratarian gunners. By the time the British were ready to attack, Line Jackson was a formidable obstacle. It was not the prettiest fortification in military history. It smelled of mud and swamp water and unwashed men. But it was solid, and behind it stood some of the most dangerous irregular fighters in the world, armed with long Kentucky rifles that could kill a man at 300 yards. On New Year's Day 1815, Pakenham's artillery opened fire with a thunderous roar that shook the earth for miles. Jackson was eating breakfast when a cannonball struck his headquarters, completely destroying the building. He and his officers escaped unharmed. Within minutes, the American batteries fired back with devastating accuracy. Within 3 hours, several British gun carriages were shattered, a howitzer disabled, and Pakenham was forced to cancel the bombardment. The American position had barely been scratched. Pakenham now faced a choice that was also a trap. He could retreat, but that meant admitting failure to the most powerful empire on earth, with 50 ships watching from the Gulf. He could wait, but Jackson was growing stronger every day as more Kentucky militiamen arrived. Or he could do what Wellington's veterans always did when the odds seemed impossible. He could attack. The night before January 8th. The night before the assault, the British camp was quiet with the specific silence of men who know they may die in the morning. Pakenham's plan was audacious and, in retrospect, reckless. He would assault Line Jackson frontally with 2 main columns. General Samuel Gibbs would lead the primary attack against the American left, where the defenders were thinnest. General John Keane would strike the right, near the river. A third force under Lieutenant Colonel William Thornton would cross to the west bank of the Mississippi in the darkness before the assault, capture the American guns there, and turn them against Jackson's line from behind. It was a classic double envelopment, if everything went perfectly. Almost nothing went perfectly. The canal that was supposed to allow Thornton's boats to reach the Mississippi was sabotaged, or simply collapsed under the weight of the boats. A dam burst, carrying vessels downstream. By the time Thornton got his men across the river, he had only 560 of the intended 1,200 soldiers, and he was hopelessly behind schedule. The main assault was supposed to wait for his signal. It would not. Worse, and this detail still mystifies historians, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mellence, commanding the 44th Regiment of Foot, forgot the fascines and ladders his men needed to cross the Rodriguez Canal and scale the earthworks on the far side. When officers realized the error in the darkness before the assault, it was too late to correct it properly. The men would have to cross open ground and attempt to scale a fortified wall with their hands. In the British camp that night, men wrote letters home. Some prayed. Many drank what rum they could find. A few, perhaps, stared into the dark and understood what the morning would bring. On the American side, Jackson's sentries strained into the cold night air. They could hear sounds from the British lines, the muffled movement of thousands of men getting into position. Jackson walked his lines, speaking to his soldiers. He was everywhere that night. The Kentucky riflemen checked their powder. The free men of color fixed their bayonets. Lafitte's gunners checked their cannon charges and waited. The killing ground, January 8, 1815. The fog came before dawn. It rolled in thick off the Mississippi, blanketing the Chalmette plantation in pale white blindness. The British commanders saw it as a blessing. Their men could advance unseen. At 6:20 in the morning, the British drums began to beat, and 8,000 red-coated soldiers began to move forward through the mist. For several minutes, there was an eerie silence on the American line. Then the fog began to lift. What happened next lasted less than 40 minutes. It would be talked about for generations. The American artillery opened up first. Jackson's 8 batteries fired grapeshot and canister, anti-personnel ammunition that turned each cannon into a giant shotgun, spraying dozens of iron balls across hundreds of yards of open ground. The British ranks, formed in the tight disciplined columns that had swept across Napoleonic Europe, were perfect targets. Each volley tore holes in the red lines. Men fell in windrows. But they kept coming. This was Wellington's infantry. They had advanced through worse. Through the smoke and the falling bodies, the British columns pressed forward, step by bloody step, toward the American earthworks 400 yards away. Then the riflemen opened fire. The Kentucky and Tennessee long rifles were unlike anything the British veterans had faced in Europe. They were accurate at distances that made European muskets useless. Jackson's frontiersmen did not fire in volleys. They aimed, each man picking his target, squeezing the trigger, reloading with practiced speed, and firing again. Officers fell first. Then sergeants. The men who carried ladders and fascines for crossing the canal were shot down before they could use them. General Gibbs rode forward to rally his faltering column. He was hit and fell from his horse, mortally wounded. General Pakenham himself rode forward through the carnage, desperate to keep his men moving. He was struck in the arm. His horse was shot out from under him. He mounted a second horse. Then grapeshot tore through him in a final, fatal volley. His staff carried him to the rear, where he died under a great oak tree, his life draining away into the Louisiana soil. For a moment, the British attack wavered, and then it broke. On General Keene's front, near the river, a British column briefly breached an unfinished section of the American line, pouring through the gap with bayonets fixed. They were met by the New Orleans Rifles and the 7th U.S. Infantry in brutal, close-quarters combat. The breach was sealed in minutes. In the center, the men of the 44th Regiment, the ones who had arrived without their fascines and ladders, reached the Rodriguez Canal and could go no further. They stood in the open, being shot down, with no way across and no way back. Some men threw themselves into the shallow water and tried to claw their way up the far bank with their bare hands. They were killed trying. The whole terrible spectacle lasted less than half an hour. In that time, the British suffered over 2,000 casualties, nearly a third of their entire assault force. 291 were killed outright, including 2 generals. Over 1,200 were wounded. Nearly 500 were captured or missing. The Americans lost 13 men dead, 39 wounded, 19 missing. When the smoke cleared, the survivors on the American line stared at what lay before them in silence. The field of Chalmette Plantation was carpeted in red. A carpet of human beings who, just 30 minutes earlier, had been marching forward with the confidence of the greatest military power on earth. A Kentucky rifleman reportedly climbed up on the parapet, looked out at the carnage, and said, "I never had so much fun in all my life." It was a brutal thing to say. It was also, in the hideous arithmetic of that morning, completely American. The brutal aftermath. The history books tend to end the story here, at the moment of American triumph. But what happened in the hours and days that followed the battle was, in many ways, too brutal for comfortable telling. The British wounded lay on the field of Chalmette for hours in the January cold, crying for water, for their mothers, for a quick end to their suffering. With over 1,200 wounded men and a battle still technically in progress, the British Army had neither the resources nor the immediate capacity to retrieve all of them. Some lay there for the remainder of the day. The dead were even harder to account for. In the days that followed, the British Army had to negotiate a grim truce to retrieve their fallen. Hundreds of bodies had to be buried in the Louisiana soil, men who had sailed across the Atlantic to conquer a city, now left to rot in a foreign swamp. Pakenham's own body was preserved in a barrel of rum for transport back to England. He was 46 years old. On the West Bank, Thornton's reduced force had actually achieved its objective. The Americans there broke and ran, and the British captured their artillery. If Thornton had crossed earlier with his full force, the guns might have turned the main battle's outcome. General Lambert, now in command after the deaths of Pakenham and Gibbs, looked at this success and at the catastrophe on the East Bank and made the only rational decision available. He ordered the withdrawal. The British Army retreated back the way it had come, more than 60 miles through the same miserable bayous and coastal marshes they had traversed weeks before. They had to carry their wounded. They had to leave behind men too injured to move. The withdrawal took days, and it was a slow, miserable procession of defeat. Jackson, despite pressure from his officers to pursue, declined to chase them aggressively. His army was exhausted. He did not fully know the extent of the British collapse. And he was, above all, a cautious commander when the city behind him was still potentially at risk. Instead, he turned his fury inward. Jackson had declared martial law in New Orleans before the battle, and he refused to lift it even as the crisis passed. He distrusted the French Creole population. He suspected Louisiana state politicians of disloyalty. When a French-language newspaper published an article criticizing him, he arrested the editor. When federal judge Dominic Hall ordered a writ of habeas corpus for the arrested editor, Jackson arrested the judge. When news of the Treaty of Ghent, officially ending the war, finally reached New Orleans in March, Jackson still refused to lift martial law until he received official orders from Washington. Judge Hall eventually fined him $1,000 for contempt of court. Jackson paid it without complaint and walked out to a cheering crowd that surrounded him in the street. New Orleans remembered. But it eventually forgave. In 1851, the great military parade ground in front of the St. Louis Cathedral was renamed Jackson Square. A dramatic bronze sculpture of Jackson on horseback was installed at its center in 1856, and it stands there still. The war that was already over. Here lies perhaps the strangest and most poignant fact of the entire Battle of New Orleans. The war was already over. American and British diplomats had been negotiating in Ghent, Belgium since August 1814. On December 24, 1814, 2 weeks before the battle, they signed the Treaty of Ghent, ending the War of 1812. The treaty essentially restored the status quo. No territory would change hands, no major concessions would be made. The war would simply stop. But news crossed the Atlantic by sailing ship. It would not reach America for weeks. Neither Jackson nor Pakenham knew. Neither the men who died on the field of Chalmette nor the men who killed them knew that they were fighting and dying in a war that, on the other side of the ocean, had already been declared finished. 2,000 casualties. 13 American dead. All for a battle that, in strict military and diplomatic terms, changed absolutely nothing about the outcome of the war. And yet, the battle had consequences that reverberated for decades. Andrew Jackson became the most celebrated military hero in American history since George Washington, a legend who would ride that fame to the White House in 1828, reshaping American democracy in ways that still echo today. The victory at New Orleans entered American mythology as proof that the common man, the frontiersman, the irregular fighter, could defeat the greatest professional army in the world. Epilogue: Blood in the Cane. Today, the Chalmette battlefield is a quiet park southeast of New Orleans. The Rodriguez Canal is still there, shallow, grassy now, unimpressive to the casual eye. In January, the air is cool and damp off the Mississippi. Herons walk in the reeds. If you stand on the line of the old earthworks and look out across the flat, open ground toward where the British came from, it is hard at first to grasp what happened here. The space seems small. The field seems peaceful. The past has been absorbed into the land. But on the morning of January 8, 1815, this quiet field was a slaughterhouse. In the space of less than 40 minutes, it consumed 2,000 men, brave men, well-trained men, men who had marched across the battlefields of Europe and survived. They came forward in the morning fog with drums beating and flags flying, and the defenders behind that muddy wall took them apart. No one who was there that morning ever forgot it. History, in its official accounts, tends toward the clean and the comprehensible. It talks of tactics and commanders, of treaties and consequences. It is less comfortable with what actually happens when two armies meet in a field. The final minutes of the Battle of New Orleans were too loud, too bloody, too fast, and too one-sided. They ended an era and began another. They were, in the truest sense, American.